Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum. I apologize for not showing up last week. We had to postpone it by 1 week because of an event at MCA for which I had to be present. And that was not a planned event. But inshallah, we'll cover tonight what we were going to cover last time. This is about a narrative about the book summary of the bestseller, Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And I prefer to use the term extract rather than book summary. Book summary is always a challenge. It's very difficult to summarize what's written in a book. But the reason I call it extract is that we want to get to the essence of what he's saying in the book and its relevance to us. And you may find that the subject, most of what we talk about today, is a little departure from our topics that we have covered so far. But then this topic is not any alien to Islamic discourse. In fact, in my view, this is one of those numerous missing parts in a typical Islamic discourse. So this is, in my view, very much an Islamic discourse. And we take the help of a non-fiction book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It is not a fiction book, so it is not a story, it's not a novel. It's based on the true story of John Perkins. Okay. Inshallah, we'll start by defining what an economic hitman is, then a brief introduction of the author and how he got into this business. Right? And we'll talk about the methods used by the economic hitman as John Perkins describes. We'll look at examples of some countries where economic hitmen operated. And we'll look at three countries, Saudi Arabia, Ecuador, and Panama, inshallah. And in the book he talks about numerous countries, but we are looking at an extract. Obviously in 1 hour we cannot talk about everything, right? This book tells the story of author John Perkins' life as an economic hitman, but we'll not look at his personal life. About his personal life, he was married to the daughter of the head of Bechtel Corporation. You heard of Bechtel? I think everybody heard about the Bechtel Corporation, the corporation that executes massive mega projects, etc. But rather we will, to an extent, examine his story and what he reveals in the light of what Islam teaches us. Because ultimately all that is learned must be viewed through the lens of Islam. That's our criterion. Quran is our criterion. Al-Furqan, right? And that is the criterion to which everything that is learned must be subjected to. And in this process, inshallah, we'll pose some questions and try to answer those questions. So John Perkins, the author, begins with a rather dramatic definition of an economic hitman. He says, economic hitmen, plural, men, are highly paid professionals who cheat countries out of trillions of dollars. Now that's a rather dramatic definition of what economic hitman is, right? And the job is what they do is they funnel money from the traditionally known aid organization like World Bank, USAID, United States Agency for International Development, and such aid organization. They funnel money from there to the coffers of some huge corporations and the pockets of some very wealthy families. And we'll see how they do it, what is the process. And in doing so, their tools include, the methods or the tools that they deploy includes fraudulent financial reports, it includes rigged election, bribes, payoffs, murder, sex, all of the above. Right? And he says, and I quote him, they play a game as old as empire, but one that has taken on new and terrifying dimensions during this time of globalization. I should know. I was an economic hitman. That's Perkins talking, not me. He was an economic hitman. So the author, Perkins, started his career as an economic hitman in 1971. So roughly 44 years ago, something like that, right? And in 1982, after looking at what he was doing, he tried to write about it. But then he was persuaded not to write. And he says the persuasion came in the form of financial incentives and some sort of threats also. And he tried to write his story about 4 times after that, over the next 20 years or so. But each time, he was persuaded to give it up. But finally, in 2002, he prepared a draft. He went to a major publisher. And the publisher looked at it, the publisher liked it, but he says, I cannot risk publishing this. Can you fictionalize it? Can you make it like it's not a true story? Tell it like a story. Can you fictionalize it? Make it a work of fiction as opposed to non-fiction. And Perkins did not want to do that. But in 2003, he found a courageous publisher who was willing to publish this book. And Perkins was hired to work at a Boston consulting firm called Chas T. Main. Main as in Main Street, same spelling, as an economist. But his education background had nothing to do with economics. He was hired as an economist, right? He was mentored into that job at Chas T. Main by a woman, an attractive and intelligent woman that he names as Claudine. And we're not going to talk much about Claudine herself, but she explained to him his job. She was not an employee of Chas T. Main. She was not an employee of that corporation, but she was hired as a consultant to that corporation. And she informed John Perkins that her assignment was to mold him into an economic hitman, right? And she told him, no one can know about your involvement, not even your wife. And she explained to him that your job is to encourage world leaders to join a vast network that promotes certain U.S. commercial interests. That's how Claudine explained his job, his mission. And she said, in the end, those world leaders become ensnared, they become drowned in a web of debt. Debt, right? That ensures their loyalty. He said, we can then draw on their loyalty in future, whenever we need upon them. And in return, what they get is that they get to bolster their popularity among their own people, because they bring to their people these mega projects, like they build an international airport or some power plant and these kinds of construction or major development projects. The owners of the corporations and those few wealthy families, they get fabulously wealthy as a result of this. And also the elite or the ruler or the dictators in those countries, they also become wealthy. And that's how she explained his job, summarizing that his job is to trap the countries into debt. Perkins' job as an economist was to produce, his job within the whole system was to produce economic forecasts. And he was not the only economic hitman. There were many who were operative. Excuse me, I'm a little bit under the weather. And Claudine described that there were 2 primary objectives of Perkins' work. Number 1, he was to justify huge international loans that would funnel money back to her corporation and many other corporations, and he names Halliburton, Bechtel, etc., from the aid-giving organizations or international creditors, moneylenders, for example. And he was to work, number 2, second objective, He was to work to bankrupt those countries. This is a job description, the objective of the job that was given to him, so that they would be forever beholden to their creditors, so that we can draw upon their loyalty in future when we need favors. And what kind of favors? He mentions various, such as a vote in the United Nations, or military basing rights, on military bases in the countries, or getting access to development of their natural resources, oil and mineral resources. And this is how it worked. An economic forecast is produced for any country, say country X, which shows great benefits of a massive development project. Why massive development project? If you are going to build a little building, the money is not big. The purpose is to trap the country into debt. So the projects have to be big, for which big money has to be loaned, that they will have to eventually pay back with interest. So they are coerced. They're supposed to be to help the countries, that's the message that is given. And they are coerced, bribed into signing off on these massive projects, the leaders of the countries. And then the major creditors, such as IMF, World Bank, etc., they would sanction big loans for these projects. And of course, the money goes to these big corporations who will actually execute or construct or build those projects in those countries. Usually, such development projects are aimed at exploiting mineral or oil resources or other mineral resources. And in this process, the corporations and some leaders, like the dictator in the country and his cronies, you can say, they become wealthier. But the people of that country are saddled with debt, 100% of the debt, which they have to work hard to pay back, principal and interest. And these projects actually benefit only the elite or the few people in charge in countries, And little, if any, benefit at all goes to the common people, poor people. And he gives an example. Let's say you're building a massive power plant. That's the proposal, to build a massive power plant in a country. The power plant, when built with the help of the creditors, right, IMF, World Bank, etc., will principally supply power to, operations of other international corporations who may be doing, for example, mineral mining and oil and other kinds of development over there. Those are their interests. And some of the beneficiaries of that power output would be the elite if they have their own little industries, etc. But the common public will derive very little benefit. And he gives the example of a country that about 3% of the benefit goes to the masses, to the people of the country. And the rest is essentially taken by the special interest. And as Perkins explains, that is the aim of this whole scheme, to have the people of that country trapped in debt in a way that they can never dig themselves out of it. So you see, they may be benefiting only 3% or 2%, but they are saddled with 100% of the debt. So what happens when they get these big projects and they are trying to make payments, right? And they find that they're unable to make payments. What happens then? What happens is that the economic hitman steps in again and brings the idea of another project. That project is supposed to, the projected effect of that project would be that it will generate such revenues that it will take care of their old project as well as the new project. And this becomes easier when it's done through the bribes, etc. If you have a corrupt elite, corrupt rulers, etc., they will do it for a payoff. Or they could be intimidated into doing it. And so they create an illusion that in this race between development and the debt payment, eventually development will win and they will become prosperous. The stated purpose of this system of aid, it's a very fine word, actually, is giving money on riba. It's giving money on interest, the creditors. When a country gets aid, it's not aid as in help. It's not qard hasana. It's not aid as in help. It is loan on interest. And the stated purpose has been that, the scheme of giving money through these international aid crediting organizations is to uplift those poor countries, to bring them on par with the developed countries so that they can join the community of prosperous nations. That is the stated purpose, right? But Perkins cites some statistics, and these are very stark statistics. In 1960, if you looked at the income of the 20% of the world's population living in the wealthiest countries, right? And 20% of the world's population living in the poorest countries. 20% in the wealthiest countries and the 20% in the poorest countries. In 1960, the ratio of this income to this income stood at 30-1. And that was the time when IMF and this aid giving began, when countries came out of colonization, etc. After 3.5 decades, after 35 years of this aid and development program, that ratio stood at 74-1. That means the income of the 20% in the wealthiest countries and 20% in the poorest countries, the income ratio was 74-1. It became much worse, from 30-1 to 74-1. So the stated purpose may be a stated purpose, but that's not how it works. That's not how it will work. And the stated purpose is a false pretext. And why and how so many countries allowed themselves to be sucked into this vortex of what Perkins calls as modern-day slavery. It is a modern-day slavery of sorts. He says that he's coined a term called corporatocracy. It's not an English word. He's coined a term, corporatocracy, to describe this system, which consists of the interests of these corporations, some wealthy families, and their very strong connections in government and media. This system, he calls it corporatocracy. Right? And this is a very powerful system that's working to cause this modern-day slavery. And it's enslavement, not mere enslavement. I say this is enslavement in style. It's enslavement in style because the typical proverbial, you can say, or stereotypical view of a slave master and slave is that the slave master has a whip and he is exploiting the slave physically, he is working hard till late night, etc. But in this case, the slave does not know who the slave master is. The slave master is isolated from the slaves by this system or this web comprising of media, government connections, corporations, etc., etc., etc. At this point, let us pause and ask ourselves the question, what, if anything, Islam has to say about this? We're talking about this money being given, credit. This is interest. It's a riba, right? It's riba. We know Islam has a lot to say about riba, but let's examine this. We want to look at the scale and monstrosity of this phenomenon called riba. So let's examine what the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ teach us. Islam teaches that the riba is a tool of a highest form of oppression, So see, Prophet ﷺ goes to Mecca from Medina to perform his first and last Hajj, his only Hajj that he performed. And there he gives what has come to be known as the last sermon. And we know all of us know the contents of the last sermon. We are very familiar with that. And he asked the people, if you are asked about me, what will you say? He inquired. And I'm paraphrasing this. What will you say? And the people said, we bear witness that you have conveyed the trust. When he asked, have I conveyed the trust? Have I conveyed my message? And people affirmed it we bear witness that you have conveyed the trust. So that sermon was characterized by a sense of finality. If you look at it, his last Hajj, right? It symbolized the completion of his prophetic mission. If you look at the words, those words epitomized the completion of his prophetic mission. And after that, the Prophet ﷺ returned to Medina. When he returned to Medina, he had less than 3 months to live. I think about 81 days to live. He returned to Medina. And then came a revelation. And this is, I'm going to refer to part of it. The third ayah of Surah Al-Ma'idah. حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمُ الْمَيْتَةُ وَالدَّمُ وَاللَّحْمُ الْخِنْزِيرِ إِلَى آخِرِ الْآيَةِ. Within this ayah is contained a declaration, a divine declaration that we are all familiar with. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا. This day have I perfected for you your deen. This day have I completed for you your deen, perfected for you. The job is done. This is a divine declaration. Deen is complete. And he says, I have completed my favor unto you. أَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي. Right? وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا. Meaning, I have ordained for you to stay forward Islam as your deen. So there's no ambiguity in this. This is a declaration. Deen is complete. But then, after this completion, comes the revelation of verses 279, 280, and 281 of Surah Al-Baqarah. Now, and that raises an interesting question. If the deen is complete, what are these verses trying to convey? It's an interesting question, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares that the deen is complete. And then come these 3 ayahs, 3 verses. Now, how do we know that these are the last 3 verses? We know this on the strength of a hadith reported by Abdullah ibn Abbas in Sahih Bukhari, that these were the last 3 verses revealed. So, when we write a letter, sometimes we forget, right? At the bottom of the letter, we write PS or postscript. But we cannot harbor the notion, astaghfirullah, that this is postscript. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's no afterthought for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there must be a reason why this revelation came after that. So we as thinking people, as Muslims, we should try to ponder or analyze and think through about this. So perhaps the answer lies in the contents of these verses, the 3 verses. In these verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet declare war on the moneylender. Now, we're not talking about who lends money as qard hasana. You know what I mean when I say when he declares war on moneylender, right? Moneylender was a word which was for centuries used in English literature, European literature. It was a common word, right? But lately, in the last 100 years or so, maybe a little more than 100 years, this has been sanitized into a new word called the banker, which doesn't sound as bad as moneylender, right? Now, we're not talking about a teller you see at the counter when you go to a bank. We're not talking about that. But you know what I'm trying to say, right? Perhaps it was meant to warn not just us but humanity to beware of riba. Those ayahs that declare war on people who indulge in riba. And this revelation places an emphasis on riba, perhaps in the hope that we'll take notice and take steps to preserve and protect ourselves from the scourge of riba. And Allah knows best. Today, the world is swimming in riba. or rather it's actually, one would say, drowning in riba. Prophet ﷺ said in the end times, there will be kathratul riba. In the age of Dajjal, there will be kathratul riba. You know. And most of us think of riba as interest payment. You know, you buy something and then you pay X% or so. That's how we think. And so we take care. We don't buy things on interest, whether it's car, house, whatever, different people. And we're not going to get into the fiqh dimension of these things. But this is the meaning that we associate with riba. But there are other forms of riba. Example, we'll take an example. Prophet ﷺ said, and I'm going to paraphrase in order to illustrate the point. Prophet ﷺ said, a man comes to the market with goods to sell. He comes to the market, right? And you meet him outside the market. You meet him outside the market and you offer to buy his goods. He said, I can take your goods so much. And the man agrees. He said, okay, what is the price? You know, you agreed, you shake hands, it's a deal. And it's a mutually agreed deal. It's not that the man was coerced, no, it's a mutually agreed deal. He might even say that, thank you, you know, it saved me time, mashallah. You know, he might even say that. That's not the point. You made a deal. But then the man goes into the market and he finds out that he could have sold his goods for a better price and obtained a better profit. So what did you do? What you did was you exploited his lack of complete knowledge of market conditions in order to get an unfair advantage for yourself, right? So you ripped him off. Prophet ﷺ said, that is riba. It's one of the definitions. This is riba. Now, you didn't charge a percentage or something. You ripped him off. That comes under riba. This is what Prophet ﷺ said. And he gave the example of the man coming to market, the way I explained now. And so we will not get into all the different forms of riba, but we want to develop an awareness of the severity of this monstrous phenomenon. I use the words a monstrous phenomenon called riba through this hadith, if you pay attention. Paraphrasing again, Prophet ﷺ said riba consists of 70 different parts. Riba comes in 70 parts, 70 different parts. And the smallest part of which is tantamount to or equivalent to a man marrying his mother. Just imagine. Why we understand from Quran and Prophet ﷺ's teaching why riba is a tool of highest form of oppression. Let's come back to the book, Economic Hitman, and look at the techniques used by the economic hitman. Perkins said that in poor countries, we hitmen dress like local school teachers and shopkeepers. We appear humble, we give interviews, we talk to common people, we go with charts and spreadsheets, we talk to government agencies, maybe government departments, etc. And we talked about the miracles of macroeconomics, not micro, macroeconomics. Why macroeconomics? You want big projects because you want to give big money and trap the population into debt. That's why macroeconomics. It's not small potatoes. And this is not illegal in today's world. I mean, you know, giving money for development aid on interest, this is prevalent all over the place. It's not illegal. And what if the leadership of that country, which is offered this proposition, refuses to accept it, right? Perkins says, when that happens, when the hitman fails, then it's time for another kind of hitman to step in. And in that business, that type of hitman is called the jackal. The jackal has a function. His job is to first try to coerce, intimidate, or threaten the leadership. And he gives the example of some jackal, another type of hitman, visiting some head of state in Central America, etc. And they'll come and threaten them, something will happen to you, something will happen to your family, your daughter, your mother, your brother, things like that. And when the threats fail, intimidation fails, then they arrange for accidents. Accidents happen, and the leaders are met with violent deaths. This is Perkins' description, not mine. And Perkins traces the beginning of this methodology to 1953. What happened in 1953? See, in 1951, Iran elected a prime minister by the name of Muhammad Mossadegh. I don't know if any of you are aware. Muhammad Mossadegh was elected the prime minister of Iran. He was educated in Europe, he studied in Switzerland, and he had a PhD in law. And upon his return after finishing his doctorate in law, he came back to Iran and he was a professor at Tehran University. He was a people's man. He was very popular. He was a very popular, democratically elected prime minister of Iran. In fact, in 1951, when he was the prime minister of Iran, Time magazine chose him as the man of the year. So if you go back and look at the records, 1951, Time magazine, the man of the year was Muhammad Mossadegh, right? He did a lot of good things for his people, especially in the agricultural sector. He brought a lot of reforms, to help through land reform, actually, so that farmers are helped. And with his popularity as an elected prime minister in place, the power of the head of the state, who was the Shah at that time, his power was somewhat diluted because the actual working prime minister, working government was Mossadegh's government. And at that time, Iran's petroleum industry has been under the British control since 1913, roughly about 4 decades, through what was then known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Petroleum Company. This was the forerunner of today's BP, British Petroleum. Mossadegh nationalized the country's petroleum resources. Why? Because he was seeing that these resources are not at all benefiting his people. So he took that step and nationalized it, and that angered Britain. It was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, right? That angered Britain. So Britain at that time was not the ruling state in the world. In 1951, after the Second World War, the United States appeared on the, you can say, in the unfolding historical landscape as the ruling state, the state that called shots, right? So Britain took the help of the United States, and both countries thought what to do. And they thought joint military action may not be a good idea because that might provoke Soviet Union. And some of you might not know Soviet Union. It was Russia plus so many countries, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, Ukraine, etc., etc., etc. It might be provoked into coming in support of Iran at that time. So what they did something else. Instead of outright military attack, Washington dispatched a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt was the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president of the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, early 1900s, very early 1900s. And we'll see his name come up again. And Kermit Roosevelt went with suitcases of money or whatever, and through payoffs and bribes and threats, he orchestrated street riots. And violent demonstrations, and tried to create the impression that Mossadegh was not only inept, but he was also unpopular. And if we keep our eyes open and we are thinking cap on, these things haven't gone away, these tactics haven't gone away. You just have to look around. if Kermit Roosevelt had been discovered, then the United States would have been directly implicated in the overthrow of a democratically elected government. But then at that time, this thing was classified information, and later on, the United States itself declassified the information and admitted this is what they had done. So in 1953, as a result of these street riots, Mossadegh was overthrown, and Shah, who was the figurehead, resumed full control, and he was the man of the West. And this methodology has been adapted. IMF, World Bank have come into the picture, and it's that same methodology with some adaptations is working today, according to Perkins. Perkins served as an economic hitman in Saudi Arabia. Okay. Here, the model was different. Saudi Arabia was a different country, not just any other poor country. It was a vast country, and it had vast resources of oil and a relatively small population. So a different approach was necessary over here. And the approach was like this: use the revenues of the Saudi oil sales to have the American corporations, big corporations, build Saudi Arabia. So use that money to hire American corporations, large corporations, to build Saudi Arabian infrastructure. So that was the general idea, right? And Perkins' job was to develop forecasts of what would happen when a particular development project is executed. And his job was also to create scenarios in which oil revenues can be used to invest in massive development projects. So that was his job on the Saudi project, so to speak. He recounts a 1974 incident when he was talking to a Saudi diplomat who showed Perkins some photographs of the city of Riyadh. And one of the photographs caught Perkins' eyes, and that showed a pile of garbage, and a goat was rummaging through the pile of garbage. And he inquired with the diplomat, what is this picture about? So the diplomat said that no self-respecting Saudi will collect trash, so we leave the job to the goats. This was the answer that Perkins received. But as a result of this came a garbage collection system for the city of Riyadh, complete on the American lines, with the garbage collection trucks, etc. that we have. Yeah, the same system was implemented for the city of Riyadh as a consequence of this discussion. But that was just the beginning. Perkins says, he describes other arrangements, that other arrangements included recycling massive parts of oil revenues into United States Treasury bonds. And the interest on those bonds will be used to do infrastructure development, to execute projects in Saudi Arabia, right? To finance construction projects. And in return, U.S. extended security to the Saudi government. Right? And another arrangement, another description of the arrangement is that massive revenues would be transferred to U.S. Treasury, which will act as a trustee, overseeing development projects. Meaning American companies are executing, building over there, and they will be paid for their work from the trustee in the U.S. Treasury Department. Very few countries will relinquish the right to manage their own money to somebody else, but this was the arrangement. And he said this was a sweet arrangement for both sides. All these massive amount of petrodollars got recycled into U.S. Treasury on the one hand, and for Saudis it was convenient. They didn't have to do anything. The country gets built, etc. No headaches. Somebody else is doing the job for them. And of course, the security for the ruling elite, right, was part of the guarantee. What happens if the economic hitman fails and the jackal? We talked about jackal, right? What happens if the jackal also fails? Does the system give up its objectives, says, let's go home, it's not going to work over here? No, they don't. Perkins explained that when even the jackal fails, then the final option is to start a war. It's time to send the boys to do the dying and killing. It's time to start a war. And the stated purpose of the war could be something nice, that you want to go and protect some oppressed people, or you want to go and liberate the people of a country from the clutches of a brutal dictator. It could be whatever reason. The reasons given might appear not just nice, but they may even appear righteous. Well, that's the stated purpose, not the real purpose, right? According to Perkins, in Iraq, both the economic hitmen and the jackals failed. The Saudi model of development, where the massive amounts of revenues, oil revenues, is recycled into the US Treasury, was offered to the Iraqi leadership. But their temperament was different. They thought that they had their own minds, they know how to spend their own money, they can pick their own projects and buy their own stuff and execute the projects by themselves. And they were capable people. Iraq had a very, very good education system, and they had a very smart population in general. So when that failed, economic hitmen failed, when the Iraqi leadership did not buy into that proposition, the jackals were sent. And according to Perkins, the jackals failed because they could not penetrate the security around the Iraqi leadership. The jackals failed also. And that's why he says the two wars, one in 1991 and the other in 2003, were arranged. Now let's visit the cases of Panama and Ecuador. But before we look at the work of economic hitmen in Panama or Ecuador or anywhere in Latin America, some historical background is important. So we'll cover some important historical background. President Monroe, US President Monroe, in 1823 enunciated or elucidated or articulated a doctrine which has come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. According to that doctrine, the US had special rights in the Western Hemisphere, including the right to invade any country in Central and South America. Any country that refuses to back the US policies. So in those days, at the time of President Monroe and the rest of the 19th century, Panama used to be part of Colombia. It was one country, Colombia. And in the latter part of the 19th century, a French architect named Ferdinand de Lesseps, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name in a true French way, but that was his name. He decided to build a sea level canal at the Colombian Isthmus. You know what an isthmus is? ISTHMUS? Well, we're in Belmont, we're in the peninsula. A peninsula is a piece of land that's surrounded by water on three sides. That's why we call this peninsula. An isthmus is a narrow strip of land on both sides of which are large bodies of water. And of course, if you're building a canal, you'll build where the land is narrow, connecting the two bodies of water, right? You're not going to build a 500-mile long canal. Anyway, he decided to build that canal, and he worked hard. There was a lot of digging. The project continued. A lot of resources were put into it, but it was a financial disaster, and he abandoned it in 1889. Anybody who's from Egypt? You're from Egypt. Have you heard the name Ferdinand de Lesseps? Ferdinand de Lesseps was the architect who directed the construction of the Suez Canal. So anyway, he failed there in Panama, the Panama Canal. So in the first years of 20th century, 1901, 2, 3, 4, we're talking about that time frame, right? Who was the president at that time? Teddy Roosevelt, the grandfather of Kermit Roosevelt. He was the president at that time. The U.S. demanded that Colombia, remember, Colombia, Panama was one country at that time. So U.S. demanded that Colombia sign an agreement with a North American consortium to give away the isthmus over to that consortium. Sign an agreement to give away that isthmus, that narrow strip of land, to this consortium. I guess Colombians felt that they have their own dignity, and they said, sorry, no. They refused. Okay. But that was not acceptable to President Teddy Roosevelt. So in 1903, he dispatched USS Nashville, a naval ship, and US soldiers invaded Colombia at that time, and they seized the local commander where they landed. He was a very popular local commander. They seized him and they shot him dead. They killed him, and then they made a new country out of it called Panama and declared it as an independent nation. And a puppet government was installed, and the first canal treaty was signed between Panama and the United States. The first canal treaty was signed. The canal wasn't built there. That was the intent, to get the isthmus under a North American consortium's control, right? So what did the canal treaty do? It has, I'm sure, many provisions, but there are two key provisions for us to keep in mind. Number one, it established an American zone. It's called the Canal Zone. And people who have traveled there, a lot of Palestinians had business in the canal zones then, and on both sides of the waterway, there was an exclusive American zone where American sovereignty applied. Okay, and the treaty itself, the Canal Treaty itself, legalized U.S. military intervention and gave Washington a virtual control over the newly born nation of Panama, right? So it's interesting to note that the treaty was signed between two persons. One was the U.S. Secretary of State at that time, last name Hay, Hay, and a French engineer whose name was Philippe Varilla. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correct. He was one of the engineers in the first canal team of Ferdinand de Lesseps. So these two people signed the Canal Treaty. So did you get this? It was not signed by a single Panamanian. So Panama was forced to detach itself from Colombia in order to serve certain U.S. commercial interests through a treaty signed between an American and a Frenchman. Did you digest that? And then on for more than half a century, Panama was ruled by an oligarchy. Oligarchy, the elite, a few people who call the shots in the country, was ruled by an oligarchy of wealthy families and right-wing dictators, with very strong connections to Washington, and that's why they were the rulers. And between 1903 and 1968, through the provisions in the treaty, U.S. intervened militarily into Panama 12 times. In 1968, a coup happened in Panama, and General Omar Torrijos came to power. Torrijos himself was not involved in the dynamics of the coup. He did not actually pull off the coup. But as a result of the coup, through the dynamics, he emerged as the leader. He was a very kind man. He was a very well-respected man. He was not involved in the coup. He was a people's man, a compassionate man, and he was admired not just in Latin America but around the world. Torrijos was committed to, he was committed to making his country as a refuge for all those who are persecuted anywhere. He was committed to making his country, Panama, a refuge for the persecuted people. And in Latin America, there's a more recent example of another country offering refuge to a persecuted people called the Palestinians, who did not need travel, visa, etc. to land in that country. Do you know which country and which leader offered that? Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, our, 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 our covenant is with truth. We should say the truth. Torrijos was praised throughout the hemisphere. He had acquired the reputation for resolving differences among many factions that were tearing countries in Latin America apart. Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Cuba, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, all these countries were being torn apart by factional parts. And Omar Torrijos saw himself, and he acted as a reconciliation agent to bring people together, to bring stability, to bring peace. That's why he was very much respected around the world, not just there. The term in the Western media for Omar Torrijos was the strong man. That's the nearest you come to something without completely demonizing a person, a strong man. He was a general, but very well respected. And he was determined to win freedom from the United States. This is what Perkins writes. What is that freedom? His canal was in U.S. hands, right? Panama Canal. But he didn't want to join with any adversary of the United States and make a treaty with Soviet Union or something like that. He wanted to work things out smoothly, nicely. He was a wise person also. He wanted to reverse the conditions that were established under Monroe Doctrine. That's what he wanted to reverse. Excuse me. And the Western Hemisphere saw him as the man who could reverse the conditions in Latin America. John Perkins, in his role as an economic hitman, he met with Omar Torrijos. And he liked him much, and Omar Torrijos was very cordial, he said. He was very cordial, and he was perfectly willing to do business with the economic hitman. He told Perkins, very good, let's do business. Let's talk about projects, no problem. But he had a price. He was asking that the projects must benefit the poor people of his country. That was perplexing for John Perkins. He said the whole scheme worked on corruptibility of the elite and the rulers, and here's a man who refused to be corrupted. He wants a benefit for the poor masses of his country. But he was given the objective, the purpose of the whole scheme was to trap the people of the country into debt. But he says Omar Torrijos was a different kind of man. And Perkins was absolutely sure that Torrijos knew the game. He understood his weaknesses, but he also understood his strengths. So he told Perkins that he himself was very popular among the masses of his country, and that he was very popular in the armed forces. So he said this normal business of coup will not work over here. He said if they had to come, if they had to come and get him, they would have to arrange a CIA assassin. Now, this is what Perkins writes, And that's what he candidly told him, that this usual coup stuff is not going to work. Torrijos, who was a nationalist, who was determined to bring Panama Canal under Panamanian control. Panama Canal owned by Panama. What a novel idea. Panama Canal was not owned by Panama then, right? He was working hard for it, and fortunately for him at that time, Jimmy Carter was the President of the United States. President Carter, I was a student during Mr. Carter's presidency. Jimmy Carter had a reputation for being fair and a liberal person in American politics. He was also a religious man. I believe he was a Southern Baptist, he was a religious man. So he had that sort of a reputation. And Omar Torrijos negotiated with him, and he convinced Mr. Carter that we need to negotiate a canal treaty, or renegotiate canal treaty, to bring the canal under Panamanian control. And he convinced Carter. Carter agreed, and they came up with an agreement. But that agreement had to be ratified by the Congress. That was an uphill battle. Mr. Carter worked very hard to get that passed by the Congress. And when it was presented to Congress, ultimately the ratification passed, by a slim margin of a single vote. Single vote. In January 1981, Jimmy Carter's term ended and Ronald Reagan came into office. And when Ronald Reagan came into office, one of the first things he did, he declared he wanted to renegotiate the Canal Treaty. The treaty was signed. I don't know how many of us as Muslims we should take note of these things. We looked at the third ayah of Surah Al-Ma'idah that we just looked at this. Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum, right? What is the first ayah of Surah Al-Ma'idah say? Ya ayyuhallazina amanu awfu bil uqud. Oh, you who have attained faith, fulfill your contract. When you enter into a covenant, live by it. When you shake hands, keep your word. And the impact of breaking your word is proportional to the size of the agreement. If it involves countries, this can cause wars and certainly oppression. If one country is small, this is fasad. Right? Anyway, that was a side comment. As I said, we must view everything through the lens of what Islam teaches us, because ultimately our covenant is with truth, not with our personal interests. So let's move on to the case of Ecuador, and then we'll briefly return to Panama, and then finish, inshallah. Ecuador had oil, and it was an economic hitman success story, right? But for every $100 of oil taken out of the Ecuadorian rainforest, $75 goes to the oil companies. Of the remaining 25, three-quarters goes to service the debt, foreign debt. And whatever remains is largely spent on military, government departments, etc. And just about, Perkins estimates, $2.50 out of that goes to the poor people for their education, etc., etc. People who own all $100 of those resources, which is under their land. So, get $2.50. So the population receiving a negligible fraction of the resources that were their own to begin with. We talked about jackal. The jackal comes into action. This reminds me of, the term is very interesting. When I read the book, came in 2003. I don't know if there's a later edition. I'm not aware of it. There may be. There was a movie in the 60s called The Day of the Jackal. I'm not sure if anybody saw the movie. It was a very interesting movie. This movie was about an assassination plot to assassinate the President of France, Charles de Gaulle. Have you heard of him? Yeah. Charles de Gaulle. Interesting movie that the choice of word there, the assassin, was called jackal in the movie. And to me, it's very intriguing that the target was Charles de Gaulle. And he is very much connected with the subject we're talking in part 2, which will be, inshallah, more fascinating than tonight's talk. We'll mention Charles de Gaulle. So, one of the tools used by the system are non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. You've heard of NGOs, right? And one such NGO that was active in Ecuador was Summer Institute of Linguistics, SIL. And their stated purpose for being in the rainforest over there was that they wanted to record, transcribe, translate, understand, and study the indigenous languages of the tribes in the rainforest. And that was their stated purpose. But Perkins says the real job was something else. When they were active in Ecuador, there was a rising nationalist leader in Ecuador. His name was Jaime Roldos. And he had accused SIL, this NGO, of collusion with the oil companies, to rob the people. So SIL, the way they operated, they tried and they obtained the trust, they gained the trust of the people, and there are different ways of doing it, right? And as the story goes, as Perkins tells us, when seismological or geological reports determine that there is large amount of oil on a particular piece of land, the Summer Institutes of Language, this SIL people, would come. They're very nice, they were mixed with people. They would come to the tribals and they would encourage them to move away from that land to the missions, to the missionary land. And there they would get free food, free shelter, free clothes, and free missionary education. Right? But this was not all fi sabilillah. This was not fi sabilillah. They had to deed away their land to the oil companies. And after gaining trust, SIL would encourage those masses. And he talks about an interesting thing that he heard, that SIL was involved in. That SIL as an NGO had arranged from somewhere to have a large amount of food aid delivered to the tribes, the tribal people over there. But this food aid was laced heavily with laxatives. So when the people received this, there was an epidemic of diarrhea. Then the NGO came with medicine to cure their epidemic of diarrhea. They're coming to cure them, help them out of this epidemic of diarrhea. And that's how they would gain the trust. And once you gain somebody's trust, you can get them to do so. And I'm not making this up. This is what Perkins writes in his book. So, Jaime Roldos, the rising leader that we mentioned, he was eventually elected the president of Ecuador. He was a man of tremendous integrity, just like Omar Torrijos. But this fellow was elected, he didn't come through a coup. Early in 1981, and this was the time when in 1980, roughly in January 1981, Mr. Carter's term had ended and Mr. Ronald Reagan had become the president of the United States. He was in the White House. He was sworn in as the president. And there was a marked shift in the attitudes in the White House in Washington. And he talks about a curious thing, that Mr. Carter was, Jimmy Carter, was committed to reducing his country's dependency on foreign oil. So as a symbolic gesture, what he had done was he had installed solar panels on the roof of the White House. As a gesture, solar energy. When Ronald Reagan came into the White House, one of the first things he did, he took down the solar panels. That's an example of the temperament prevailing at that time in the White House. So at this time, Jaime Roldos introduced a hydrocarbon law. Hydrocarbon is petroleum law. The petroleum oil is a chemical chain made of hydrogen and carbon atoms, complex molecules. The hydrocarbon law is what petroleum. As he was seeking to reform the country's relationship with the oil companies, the foreign companies. And it was a revolutionary legislation aimed at, inshallah we'll finish on time, aimed at helping the people who needed the help most, the poor people of his country, of Ecuador. Then he did something else. He had accused this NGO SIL of collusion with the foreign interests, right? He kicked them out of the country. Then he went to these foreign countries and said they have to implement his plan for helping the poor people, his reform plan. Otherwise, he will ask those companies he'll kick them out, he'll leave the country. So then started a barrage of propaganda in other countries, which demonized him and showed him as a nutcase. But he wanted to, because he angered the system. He angered the system. So this propaganda against him began. And on May 24, 1981, when he had not been in office for a very long time, I would say. He delivered a major speech at the Olympic Stadium in Quito. Quito is the capital of Ecuador. Ecuador is Spanish for equator because the country is on the equator, middle of the earth. He delivered a major speech and then he flew to a small town in the south of the country. That was May 24, 1981, and as he was flying, his plane came down in a fiery crash and he perished. Right? At that time, then the newspaper headlines across Latin America screamed, CIA assassination. These were the headlines. Roldos was forewarned about an attempt on his life. He was forewarned about an attempt on his life. So he took some precautions. Like he would fly in two airplanes, one real airplane and a decoy airplane. On that day, May 24, 1981, one of his closest security officers convinced him to take the decoy plane instead of his real plane. And it blew up. Excuse me. I do hope you will see that this book summary may be a book summary, but it is very consistent with Islamic discourse. We are talking about social injustice, oppression, etc. So in the 3 decades that the economic hitmen were active in Ecuador, what happened to Ecuador? It says the official poverty level grew from 50% to 70%. Okay. Underemployment or unemployment had jumped from 15% to 70%, 70. The share of national resources that were allocated to help the poorest people came down from 20% to 6%. This is after the aid program to try to help and bring the country up, right? Public debt increased from $240 million to $16 billion. Progress, mashallah, right? And today, Ecuador must, and this was back in 2003-4 time frame, maybe the numbers are worse today. It says, Perkins says today Ecuador must take 50% out of its annual budget just to service the foreign debt. So it was a success story for economic hitmen. But Perkins wrote this book out of conscience. He didn't want, in the post 9/11 world, he didn't want his daughter to grow up in a world without knowing and understanding. So he had pangs of conscience, and he wrote it out of his conscience. He got out of it. So we left the Panama story. We said we'll come back briefly to it. When President Reagan demanded that Panama renegotiate the Canal Treaty after the treaty was ratified by the Congress, Omar Torrijos refused. It was a done. He says, you're not going to renegotiate. He too, like Jaime Roldos, had expelled that NGO, Summer Institute of Linguistics, from Panama. He had expelled them. He had taken certain steps, right? And he refused to give in to the Reagan administration's demands to renegotiate the treaty. So, just 2 months after the death of Jaime Roldos, Omar Torrijos took a routine flight in his personal airplane from one city to another, and that plane came down in a fiery crash, and Omar Torrijos perished. He died, was killed. And Perkins states that his belief that both Roldos and Torrijos were executed in order to send a message to anyone who just might be thinking of standing up to the system. It was designed to send a message. And we'll stop at this time, at this point, inshallah. As I said, this is the essence or extract as I see it from the book I presented. In part 2, we'll talk about some of the lessons that we have learned here And we'll bring a lot of information from outside the book to complete the picture for us. For example, we'll talk about the petrodollar system, how it came about. We'll talk about IMF. We'll talk about the lending institutions. And that will be much more fascinating, inshallah. And we'll find, in that talk, we'll see that the problem is not merely with lending money on interest. The problem is with money itself. The problem is with money itself, and we'll learn, inshallah, about that. So, hopefully, you will be here, if Allah permits us to be here together again for that talk, inshallah. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.